Hello and welcome to the FLATLINING Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. I'm Matthew Handley. It was around a year ago that we learned of the passing of Dr. Dan Hurley. In May 2023, we had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Hurley about his career in medicine and his chondrosarcoma diagnosis. Dr. Hurley became an advocate for transparency and healthcare reform after his insurance company had denied payment for scans that would have aided his cancer treatment. After his passing, his family has continued to advocate for reform, and we had the opportunity to catch up with them last week. We talked with Dr. Traci Hurley, Dan's wife, who is also a board-certified pediatrician. We also spoke with Dan's older sister, Christine, and his younger brother, Tom. We talked about Dan's life and his desire to help others right up until the moment he passed away. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of the FLATLINING Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. Joining me right now is Dr. Traci Hurley, the spouse of the late Dr. Hurley, as well as Dr. Dan Hurley's brother and sister, two of them at least, Tom and Christine. Hello, it's good to make all of your acquaintances.
Hello. Good to meet you.
Also with us is our president and CEO of Fulcrum Strategies, Ron Howrigon. Ron, hello.
Hello, how are you? I'm obviously the least important person on this podcast, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, I want to get started by again saying thanks for sitting down with us and having more conversations about Dan. We were very blessed to have been able to speak with him about a little over a year ago, and we're now approaching the 1 year anniversary of his passing. And so I guess the first question I have for you all is, how are y'all doing?
Well, I guess I'll go first. That's always a difficult question for me to answer. I am surviving and doing the best that I can right now. This week in particular, because we are coming up on the anniversary, is very difficult for me and anxiety provoking. Lots of flashbacks to last year at this time and the amount of suffering that Dan went through, and that we all of us, Christine and Tom alike, and his other siblings went through as well.
And I would agree with Traci on that as his death date approaches, the anniversary, it is more painful. It's painful always, but you do think back to what he was suffering at this time last year, mm-hmm. and being in the hospital with him and those last days. But I also, I'm grateful that he's still present to us, and we're still very much thinking of him.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Christine and Traci said about it, particularly as the day gets closer. Some of those memories of the end, which were so difficult, to come back more. But also, I also have good memories of the end. Dan had some humor about him, even as he got near the end, so that was good. But it makes the anniversary makes me think of him more, and just have a greater sense of Dan as just someone who is just so alive. And that's kind of what makes it difficult in a way.
I think, and I obviously knew Dan for a very short period of time and didn't know him anywhere near as closely as you guys did. But he from almost the beginning, he struck me as that there are people in this world that just seem to have an impact because of who they are. I was surprised at how much of an impact Dan had on me, what little interaction I had with him. And I'll be honest with you, when I saw this recording on my calendar, I was surprised at how much it sort of struck me as well. And so I can only imagine what you all are going through and how much he impacted your life. But I think from my perspective, it's a testimony to who he was, that he could impact so many people so deeply, even somebody like me that didn't know him for very long at all. Dan's one of those people that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. hopefully, like they say, time heals all wounds, and things will, I know this week will be hard, and hopefully things will be easier, and they'll be left with just the positive memories.
We, like you said, Ron, we were blessed to be able to know Dan for a brief while, and you're right, the impact I think was profound, not only on us but on many of our listeners as well. And since we've only were able to know Dan in that moment, and I guess this question's more for Tom and Christine, tell us a little bit about what Dan was like growing up. What was family life like in the Hurley household?
You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead. You start.
Okay. So I'll say a few things, and then Christine can follow up. So I'm Dan's younger brother. I'm the youngest of the siblings. He was the second youngest. And I mean, growing up, Dan was a really adventurous and curious kid, which is he would try things that the rest of us wouldn't try. He would, think to do things and think about trying things that the rest of us wouldn't try. And he was, and I mean, that sense of adventure and curiosity really played into his adulthood as well. And as I said, the word I mentioned earlier that always comes back to me with Dan is he always seemed so alive. Like he was experiencing things, even as a kid. He experienced things that felt like more than most of us did. But also in a way that didn't, like, it drew in other people. Like it wasn't like in a way that overwhelmed other people. He was like, Dan was 4.5 years older than me, and he was the guy I played with as a kid. And which, I mean, I didn't think about it at the time, but he was 4.5 years older than me. That was a big gap, and he was still playing with me, as kind of an equal. So yeah, it was, he was impressive even as a kid. I mean, and I think stood out even as a kid in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and he was always a leader, even of his older siblings. And one of my brothers tells the funny story about how he and Bob would go to the mall, ride their bikes to the mall to play at an arcade, a video game. And then Dad found out and said, "No, you can't do that." And Dan, the younger one, says, "Oh, don't worry, we've got a solution. We're going to ride our bikes to the other mall." He didn't say we couldn't do that. Well, that is down a big hill, more lights, much more dangerous. But Dan always had a solution, and he marched to a different drum. I mean, for our birthdays, you get to choose your meal, and he wouldn't choose pizza. He would choose like squash. And we would think, why are you wasting a birthday meal on squash? I mean, this is ridiculous. But that was Dan, and he was always very smart. In fact, my parents got a call from a teacher saying, he's a problem because he answers all the questions and he doesn't give other kids a chance. And I will add to that, he skipped a couple grades. He started med school at 19, I think. But so he was intelligent, but he didn't ever make you feel that way. He was never superior. And he loved everything in life. He wasn't just he read a lot, but he wasn't bookish all the time. So that gives you an idea probably of his, and it was, reading was encouraged, and we had vocabulary lessons every night from our dad, and Dan was fascinated with words always, even to the very end in the hospital. He was using words, so that's how we grew up, and Dan was always a leader, even from the get-go.
When I heard the story about the riding of bikes to the arcade, it struck me that here's a guy who didn't have problems in life. He just had solutions. No matter what it was, it's just, well, there's a solution to this. And it was immediately like, well, of course, when he ran into some of the other challenges later in his life after his diagnosis, he didn't just say, well, that's a problem and I'm done now. Right, here's the answer. Here's the solution. And I'm sure Traci would agree that served him well in medicine, because there weren't any, I could see him as, there's not challenges, they're diagnoses and solutions, and I'm the guy who can get them. I'd love the story about, well, he didn't say we couldn't ride to the other arcade. He didn't get specific as that. That's just a wonderful story.
What kind of other specific memories do you have of Dan that stick out to you as showing the honesty and the faithfulness of his character?
Well, he did want to follow the rules. In fact, a funny one is, he was like 5, I think. He learned to ride a bike early, and he decided, as a lot of kids do, he was going to run away. And there was a rule: you can't ride your bike past a stop sign. It's just not safe. And so he rides to the stop sign because he's running away. And then he realizes, oh, I actually can't run away because there is this rule to not go beyond the stop sign. So that one, he didn't ever end up with a solution, but that was his personality.
Probably because he only didn't think long enough not to take the stop sign down or something. If he'd had more time, he probably would have removed the stop sign and said, there, now I'm not violating the rules anymore.
And he did, this came out actually at his funeral when he was very young. I don't know if he was 2 or 3. He drew a big red apple on his carpeting in his bedroom. And the rest of us were older and everybody knew he had done it. But my parents asked, okay, put your heads down. Nobody will know who did it. Raise your hand. Dan never did. And he never admitted it. So at his funeral, he had written a eulogy, which we didn't know about until the very end. And it was mainly of gratitude. It wasn't about him. It was how grateful he was. And he confessed. He said he admitted that he drew the red apple on the carpet, but never before. So.
But everybody knew, and he kept up the charade, huh? That's awesome.
Yes.
Ron was talking earlier about him as somebody who found solutions, and the thing that, and I think that's true, and also as we were saying, like even as he would find solutions for other people. It wasn't just like he wanted to get away with stuff or something. Like he would, if there was something that there was a movie that the rest of the family was allowed to see, and I was the youngest. And so I wasn't allowed to see it yet, I think, because of language in the movie. So Dan said, well, this movie is a book too. You could read the book, which has the exact same language in it. I don't think that was what my dad had in mind at all. But
another solution to a problem. I won't call it a loophole, but another, Dan finding a way to get where we need to be. That's great.
Traci, I'm going to turn to you and talk to you a little bit about where and how you met Dan and how that relationship got started and blossoming into a fruitful marriage that you have.
Yeah, Dan and I actually met in medical school. We were in the same class, and we met the first week of medical school. It was a Friday, and I remember this because we had these, at least at the beginning of our first year, we had these TGs, which were like, they'd have a keg in the quad and they would have the drink of the day, which happened to be the formaldehyde at that time, which was a fruity cocktail. Mm-hmm. And I had my anatomy dissection that day, and I was very hesitant to do that dissection. And my lab partner was a very patient gentleman, and the two of us were late in the anatomy lab. And while we were up there, Dan comes in with a mutual friend of ours, Jason, and Jason says, "Hey, this is Dan. He's 19. And, my lab partner and I look at him, we're like, 19? And he says, yeah. And he says, hey, my refrigerator's broken and my landlord's paying for all my food. So we're all going out to eat. Do you want to come? And I said, sure. And so after I finished up, I met them at a restaurant, and that really was the first day that we struck up a friendship. And we were truly best friends first for probably at least 6 months. And we were inseparable. And if you were to talk to anybody in our class, it was Trey and Dan or Dan and Trey. It was one name for the two of us the whole time. So we were together from the first week of med school.
Was it at all intimidating to see a 19-year-old med school student? I mean, I can't imagine that, like, in that environment going, what is this?
Yeah. I mean, it was a fascination more than anything. Everybody was fascinated with him, but he was so goofy. Like it was really hard to be intimidated by Dan. He was just so down to earth, and goofy is the best word I can use to describe him, and funny, and so funny. And he just, I don't know, he just made everything so much more fun. And I think everybody in our class that knew him well would agree to that.
Tell me a little bit about how long your relationship was. You obviously got engaged and married, and what did that look like? How did that? I would imagine that doing that and being in med school at the same time is quite a stressful, interesting situation. So tell me a little bit about the timeline for that.
Yeah, so it actually was pretty natural because we were together all the time. And so we studied together, and studying usually looked like me spending hours in the library actually studying, and Dan reading magazines and taking naps on the couch, and just really just wanting to be there with me, which, is lovely. I mean, he would study. I don't want to make it sound like he didn't. He did work, but things just kind of came easy to Dan. So he only had to read things one time through, as opposed to some of us who had to read it more. And if you asked him, he would always say, well, you did better than me in school. And I'm like, well, I worked 5 times as hard as you. So there was that. We actually dated for 4 years before we got engaged, and then got married almost a year later. So we were at about 5 years when we got married. We had a religious difference between us. Dan was raised Catholic, I was raised Jewish, and he was a lot more, I guess, observant in his religion than I was. And it was very important for him to make sure that, everything was done correctly in the eyes of the church. And there was things that I had to think about as well, if I was willing to do those things. So we didn't rush it. We took our time. And the funny part about that is religion had never once been an issue between us. And I think that's just because we developed a mutual respect and understanding for each other and our beliefs.
I'm curious. I remember Dan talking about how he chose his specialty, otolaryngology, or as most lay people like us would refer to as an ENT, or ear, nose, and throat doctor. I'm curious a little bit about how, what the discussions were like as you were both determining what kind of specialty you were going to go into. Is that something that you encouraged him in? Did you hope he would be a pediatrician alongside of you? What did that look like?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back to that. I think, for me, at least, I knew I was going to be a pediatrician, but didn't really realize I was going to be a pediatrician until I did my rotation. And I know Dan had expressed an interest in pediatrics, but honestly, the minute he did his rotation in ENT, I mean, you just knew that was such a perfect fit for him. He really, really liked it. And it just made sense for him to do that. Yeah.
Well, in some ways, I mean, I remember talking about he said something about he got sort of the best of both worlds, because a decent side part of his practice were kids.
Yeah.
He said, so I've got my hands in pediatrics, but I'm also got my hands in, the other part of the specialty I like. So maybe that was another Dan creating a solution to a problem. I get both. I get some pediatrics, and I get the other challenges that ENT brought to him.
Yeah, and he really did have an interest in pediatrics, and without being fellowship trained in pediatrics, was one of the main physicians who saw kids in our area, and people knew that, and he really enjoyed that, as well as complex sinus disease was another interest of his. So the consummate overachiever couldn't have just picked one thing to be good at. He decided to be good at multiple again. That's not surprising. Yeah, but he was very careful about that. And he knew he couldn't be great at everything. So there were some things as he got further along in his career that he did sort of relinquish doing, saying, you know what, I'm not doing these enough. I wouldn't want to be the person that took out, one of our family members' thyroids, for example, or, whatever it was.
Right.
So he did he knew his limits, and went with that.
I want to turn a little bit more towards the end of his life last year, and this question's for all three of you. You know, how did your relationship with Dan change as he got his diagnosis and as he was going through his treatment?
One of the things that struck me most about his diagnosis is how selfless he was. And I realized when he got his diagnosis, it was all about, he called and said, okay, this is how Traci needs help. Can you do this? He called another sibling, very specific tasks to each sibling about how we could help. And he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about his family. He even joked just about lots of things to make it easier for people. His diagnosis was never an elephant in the room. You felt like you could talk about it. Obviously, any kind of suffering like that brings people closer. And the thing all the siblings were very grateful to Dan. He did not push people away. He wanted people to come visit. He planned a vacation with the siblings to Sedona. He was very much in touch. He didn't isolate. He never said, why me? He always said, why not me? I'm better equipped to handle this disease. I've got connections in the medical field. I know how to fight the insurance companies better than other people. I've got a supportive family. Traci took an indefinite sabbatical to care for him. And he was always grateful. And I guess for me, it was just seeing his gratitude, his selflessness that came out of that. I mean, I knew he was a great guy, but the degree that I saw then, I'm very grateful for that time, having that time with him.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of that. And I mean, I think, particularly the thing that always strikes me is, as Christine said, that he didn't question, like, why me, even as I think the rest of us, and certainly I very much was thinking, like, why him? Like, seems like the last person this should be happening to. And there was, that selflessness. I remember, and I can't remember what the news was, but I remember at one point, I think he got some not great news, and I can't remember what the exact details were, shortly before Christmas. And I remember him, when he shared the specific news, saying in the email, I'm happy to talk to anybody about it, but I don't think this needs to cast a pall over Christmas. I mean, he was thinking about that. Okay, how do we have a great Christmas together? Not like what's happening to me. And also, like, I would say, like, for me, Dan lived in Arizona, I live in Connecticut. And so, like, over the years, honestly, as adults, we hadn't seen each other as much as we would have liked. We'd see each other, regularly every year. But so I saw a lot more of him, actually, in the last couple of years of his life. And I was very grateful for that. As Christine said, the fact that he did invite people in, towards the end. And that was, that was a wonderful thing in a certain, within just the, enormity of the loss, that the fact that he approached it that way allowed us to have, like, that extra time together in the last years of his life, which I really am grateful for.
And I just want to add to that, we all want to express gratitude to Traci, because when you have that kind of news, you want to isolate, just be alone. I mean, that would be the natural reaction maybe. But she, as well as Dan, they both welcomed us. They both wanted us to come, and we did. So we had a lot of time with Dan in his last 18 months. But it wasn't just because of Dan, it was also because of Traci.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I will say, though, that likewise, the kids and I are very grateful to all of you who have really been, our rocks through this. So we're so appreciative, and we needed your support, and you guys were there for it. So I appreciate that. I will say, for me being there, and for the kids, obviously, just to touch on what Ron said about his solutions guide, the second we got the diagnosis, we were scrambling. Like, he's like, okay, you know what? We gotta get moving. We gotta find all the experts in the country. And we reached out to everybody we knew, every orthopedic surgeon that we knew from med school or in the community. Who's the guy? Who's the person? Who's the gal? And from minute one, we were full speed ahead in trying to solve problems. I am still and was the worrier of the two of us. I mean, he just was more, I don't know, I think he just had a lot more, he was very logical and had a lot of faith, which helped him. And I'm the worrier. And so I think he was constantly trying to help me not worry. And a couple of our kids are worriers, and really tried to say, you know what, it's okay. There were times when he was straightforward and he's like, this is most likely going to kill me, but we're going to do everything we can. And he was just very logical in his approach. And I think a lot of that was to help calm us, because it was an incredibly stressful time, a time full of fear. Every time we did get news, unfortunately, it was almost always bad. And he just never let it show like how bad it was. Of course, I think I did that for the two of us, but he just had a very calming way. It was very important for him to show the children that he handled this with grace, both his illness and his death, truthfully.
You know, it's for me, hearing this common theme of grace and selflessness is sort of like, you know, putting the other pieces into a puzzle that I saw part of. I remember the first time I ever talked to Dan, he reached out via email because of an article I was quoted in. And, you know, and I get a lot of emails from different people and asked if, you know, if I could spare some time, which now looking back at, could I spare some time? I mean, again, you know, I said, sure. And so we set up a Zoom call, and I don't bring a whole lot of work home. I don't talk about work when I get home. It's family time for me. But I came home that evening after talking to Dan at a Zoom call with him, and told my wife, I said, there's something I need to talk to you about. And I relayed the story to her about how he reached out. And I said, and I connect to the Zoom call, and the individual that's on the other end is obviously getting some sort of treatment. I mean, I can only see the little bit of the background, but this is a hospital bed. And I'm like, you know, first I'm shocked. I don't understand. And he immediately explains what's going on. Oh yeah, I'm getting treatment right now, but it's okay. And it goes very nonchalantly. And then immediately keeps going, now, is this okay? Do you have some time to talk? And I thought, he's known me for 30 seconds and he's worried about my schedule. And he's getting treatment for, you know, what I find out later is an extremely difficult diagnosis. And that whole interaction, I came away from it. And then he explained to me, well, here's what I need help with. I want to help all these people that come after me that run into these problems. And I want to devote my life to, and I was telling this story to my wife, and she's like, that's really remarkable. And she said, why is this bothering you so much? I said, I don't know, it's bothering me as much as it is. I've sort of come to the conclusion that I'm not as good as he is. I don't think I could do this with that same level of selflessness. I mean, I'd have to throw myself a pretty good pity party for quite a while. And I'm not sure I could handle it with the kind of grace he is. From then, for me, it was sort of morphed into, if nothing else, this is somebody that I can say, well, when I deal with whatever are difficult challenges, you know, I was thinking, well, gosh, what would Dan do? You know, and try to do it anywhere close to the way he handled what was an incredibly difficult challenge. So when I hear you all talk about, you know, he's worried about Traci and this shouldn't cast a pall over Christmas and his grace, I mean, it fills in for me that picture of what an incredible guy he was. Because like I said, the first 30 seconds, I realized, why is he worried about my time? You know, this is unusual for me. So, thank you for sharing that. It's wonderful for me to sort of fill in the rest of that picture.
And Ron, at that time, he was in the hospital and he was being discharged on the call. And he told the nurses, I'm getting on this call. And we were waiting for transport to come. Yeah. And so he's like, I'm getting on this call. So don't I'm going to say goodbye, to you all now. Yeah. And so we were wheeling him to the car. He's still talking. He gets to the car. I'm driving around. We're in LA. We got stuck in LA for 22 days and because of his treatment. And I'm driving in circles. I have no idea where I am, but I can't have the navigation on because it would talk. And he's like, it has to be quiet. So we're just wandering around so that he could talk to you. It was very important to him. So
Well, I didn't know that part of it. I knew what three, but I remember seeing you guys getting into a car, but I didn't know that's what the other part of it was. Again, not surprising, given Dan.
Yeah.
I do remember from my conversation with him last year, he spoke very matter-of-factly about his diagnosis and the outlook of it. And that impressed me as someone who could be reasonably at peace with that and still have a mindset of trying to figure out, well, how do I make sure this is going to be better for other people? That was a lot of the topic of our conversation was, how do we try and change this system that has allowed some of the things that happened to him actually happened to him. And I want to turn to that now and ask you, I get Traci first, but then open it up to you, Tom and Christine as well. When you first got that first denial for the payment for his treatment, for his care, what was that like? What was the conversation like in your household? What sort of emotions did you go through at the time?
Well, I think because we're both physicians, and unfortunately we had been through something similar with our son who's had a number of knee surgeries, the feeling in the house was figures, here we go again. And again, it kind of came to Dan, the problem solver, getting on the phone and talking with who he needed to speak with, and knowing how to navigate the system somewhat did help with that. And that, was the first of many, many frustrations. It was frustrating, very frustrating every time. And the fact that he had to do this, and I'm like, I feel like there should be someone else that is supposed to be doing this on our behalf, considering the state he's in and how he's feeling. And, I feel like it was just kind of one of those things. Well, I think it can get done correctly if I do it myself. To try to navigate through that.
Tom and Christine?
I think it lit a fire under Dan, because I think he felt like this was something he had to do. And I remember early in his diagnosis, he said to me, all my life all my career, I've wanted to, it's been my dream to fight for insurance reform. And he said, maybe this is what I'm supposed to be doing now. And so that's why, I'm going to law school because I'm recovering. Maybe I wouldn't have done that if this hadn't happened to me, but I'm supposed to be doing this. And so I think it just lit that fire under him to actually try to fight it. And, he really shunned publicity. He was a very private person, but he was willing to, for the sake of other people, go public with his story. And so I think the lighting of the fire under him, that's what struck me most.
I was going to say, I agree. And because he always cared a lot about sort of patients and how they interact with insurance. And I had heard him talk about these things before, absolutely. And think about, what can we do about this? And so he cared enormously about his patients, and he had thought it through. But as Christine said, I think the diagnosis and what came after it just was sort of a catalyst that took it to a new level. And he was not somebody who would ever say well, this isn't the best time for me to do this, which it obviously wasn't. He'd look at that as, okay, this is going to make me do something, and I'm going to do it now, no matter how much it doesn't work well for me to be doing it in this moment.
And just so that the listeners don't miss, because the first time I heard it, I sort of had to backtrack. He decided to go to law school, right? As part of this, that I'm going to take up this challenge for patients that I'm never going to see, I'm never going to bill, that aren't going to know, and more than just, I want to, scream from the mountaintops, this has to change. I'm going to subject myself to law school so that I can help them even more. The first time he made some comment to me that I was like, whoa, back up. You're a physician with this diagnosis, what it means, and you went to law school? Well, yeah, that way I could help these people. Again, I'm not that good of a person. I would fail in comparison. But I also, the times that I talked to him, et cetera, he was very clear about, this is not about me. It's about the people who are going to come after me. I don't want this to glorify that, because I said to him one time I really want to make sure people understand just how courageous you are. And he said, no, That's not what this is about. It's about the patients who are not going to have to do this because of whatever groundwork I do or lay. And that, again, just is really special, because there are a lot of people that would have said, no, this needs to be about me. And I never got that sense from him.
Yeah, he never wanted it to be about him, but he was a lifelong learner. So, I mean, there was him going to law school was something that he actually would find enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
He loved to learn. He loved to read. So it wasn't, oh, he did this horrible thing.
Right.
Horrible. This is something he wanted to do. But I mean, it's so typical Dan that has a huge surgery. Half of his pelvic bone is cut off. And he's like, well, I'm sitting around. I can't walk. Might as well take the LSAT and see how I do. It's like, okay.
Might as well take the LSAT. Like,
Yeah.
I should have some ice cream after dinner too. That's.
It literally happened like that too.
Yeah.
I mean, might as well take it. And then he applied to one school and one school only. And of course he gets in and he gets a scholarship, and he's like, I think that's kind of a sign. And I'm like, I think it is. So, yeah.
Now, as part of his appeal, Dan had written a letter to one or more of the medical directors that he talked to. Ron's going to share that for us now.
Dear Doctor, I want to make you aware of how you have impacted my life and how you impact the lives of multiple patients who have never chosen to see you as a physician. You affect some of us more than others. This disparity may result from a variety of factors, from our ability to pay for out-of-pocket for denied services, or understanding of the approval process, or support resources, or the amount of time our physicians can find to fight your denial while still leaving time to treat and counsel the patients and families in front of them. My name is Dan. I am married to Traci, and we are raising Rachel, Sam, and Sarah, and 3 dogs. I have metastatic dedifferentiated chondrosarcoma. That is most certainly a fatal disease. As an oncologist, you may understand that I relish the time I have left more than someone without my disease. I am a husband, father, physician, and law student who still has a lot to give. In addition to spending time with my family, I want to bring transparency and accountability to delays caused by medical decision-making in the authorization process. This process is put in place by insurance companies and their reviewing doctors. Unfortunately, sometimes the insurance company doctor has less knowledge or experience than the physician ordering the test or treatment. Putting the case in review with this less qualified doctor to add input can add days or weeks to the time it takes to schedule testing or treatment. This letter concerns only one CT scan. Since cancer patients may need multiple simultaneous tests and treatments, you can imagine how much the review process can affect the care and timeline of a patient. As a physician for over a decade, you certainly understand that guidelines are not a substitute for clinical judgment. Although they work well for most people as a good place to start, they are not a replacement for experience and clinical judgment, which is one of the reasons my insurance company pays for your external review. They realize that a physician without experience may have been blindly applying guidelines. For example, in my case, a non-practicing pediatrician upheld a denial even after a phone call with a nationally respected sarcoma expert. We could draw an analogy between the decisions for my care made by my own doctor and the decisions Captain Sullenberg made to land the plane in the Hudson in order to save many lives. Sullenberger had to apply his expertise and clinical judgment to decide if he should stick with the manual and its guidelines, or, given the circumstances, if he should deviate from the plan. Would we expect the results Sullenberger got if he had had to consult a less experienced pilot before taking any evasive action? Even with Sullenberger's expertise, we know that the outcome of the crash could have been fatal for everybody. The same can happen in medicine, but it does not mean that we can ethically disregard expertise just because it might not make a difference. Those plane survivors benefited from a lifetime of Captain Sullenberger's experience, the same way I, as a patient, am trying to benefit from my physician's experience rather than just purchasing and referring to a book of guidelines for my care. Many medical scenarios benefit from custom application of experience and expertise on top of guidelines. You're an oncologist, but you have never met or seen me as a patient. My insurance company allowed me to know you only as the physician board certified in hematology who upheld the claim denial. To get more information, I had to submit a written request for records regarding the decision on this episode of care for one CT scan. I got a packet of about 100 pages, and there was your name near the back. At the time, I had not met my deductible, so I would have to pay for it anyway. But to get credit for my deductible, so that the insurance will start paying at some point, the test must be approved. Otherwise, despite my payments of $1,500 a month in premiums, further tests and care will be applied to the patient responsibility. People cannot afford to spend their way out of this. Physicians that treat chronic or life-threatening diseases find that some patients survive shorter or longer than they were supposed to for a multiple of poorly defined variables. That's why we should support patients in any way we can to get the indicated care as rapidly as possible. It is therapeutic for the patient and the family from both a physical and an emotional healing standpoint to know that whatever the outcome, they were treated with respect and expeditious care when it was indicated. I'm one of the lucky ones. I can usually overcome denials. For the less expensive care, I can pay for it at the front end while I fight the denial afterwards. Although your denial caused anxiety, time, and an extra $300 due to the upfront cash price, you didn't shorten my survival because I paid to get my scan on time. In many of the cases you review, patients do not realize that this is an option or cannot afford to do so, as they have already faced with a disease that had put them out of work. This letter is about one CT scan denial. As you know, a cancer patient will have dozens of scans and treatments requiring authorizations in a system where those with less expertise are empowered to deny physicians with more expertise. This can amount to weeks, months, or more of cumulative delays in diagnostic or therapeutic care over a fight for survival or eventual death. Can we as humans pretend that cumulative weeks or to months of delays in treatment over a cancer course doesn't affect the survival and quality of life for our patients, families, and their neighbors? Is that time and insurance companies to take without transparency and accountability in decision making? Is that why we as doctors went to medical school? Do you really want to be part of that denial? I don't know how much time I have left. But if I can help even a few patients who don't have a voice from being harmed emotionally or physically by an unethical system, I will have partially succeeded in my goal. I wish you the best in the future. Do not hesitate to reach out if I can recruit you to my cause. Sincerely, Dan B. Hurley, MD.
And so, Dr. Hurley, Traci, knowing what that letter said and being a physician yourself, I'm curious as to how this whole situation has changed your perspective of our healthcare system, the way that you provide treatment to patients, the kind of care that you give your patients. How has this changed your perspective of our healthcare system?
Well, my perspective has changed quite a bit because as a pediatrician, I did have some interaction with prior auths, but not a ton. And I just remember being frustrated about it. And I remember Dan and I would share stories, and he would say he did a peer-to-peer and the physician wouldn't even be an ENT. And then he would ask for their office phone number and they would say, but I'm not going to give you my office phone number, or I don't have an office. And he said, well, I think that you feel like you know what's best for this patient. So I would like to tell this patient that they need to schedule an appointment with you. And then, of course, whatever it was would get approved. And just hearing those stories, you know, when we were actually living through it over and over and over again, and thank goodness, we our oncologist in Santa Monica. Dan was part of a clinical trial in Santa Monica, and our oncologist approached Dan and said, I need you to talk to your HR person because I am doing peer-to-peers with GI doctors and people who don't even know what they're talking about. So in typical Dan fashion, he puts together a presentation, and because he held an administrative role in his practice, he had a relationship with the benefits group and the HR people, and they put him in touch with a medical director. And rather than say, hey, you got to stop this, Dan said, hey, there's a problem here. Let me help you find a solution, and gave him a whole presentation. And in that presentation, he had mentioned a nurse who we'd had an interaction with, actually about the PET scan. She was a nurse who called after he was in the emergency room following a complication, a post-op complication. And her job was to call and follow up and just make sure he had, a follow-up appointment with his doctor, that he had his medications and that he was doing okay. And she said, anything else I can help you with? And Dan says, well, actually, I have this PET scan that I couldn't get approved. And this is not in any way in her area, but she said, let me see what I can do. And rather than hang up the phone and go, whatever, this is not my job, she actually looked into it and tried to help him get it approved. So anyway, in Dan's presentation to the guy, he mentioned her, and he mentioned another woman who helped us with claims that were all processed out of network, even though they were not out of network. And the medical director said, well, I'm going to put you in touch with someone that you can work with on helping to reform what we're doing. But how about I make that nurse your clinical care coordinator? So we were very fortunate because our clinical care coordinator was an amazing woman who was so caring and so helpful to us that every time we did get a denial, she helped us get it in front of somebody who needed to see it, and helped us get approved what we could get approved. So that was a huge help to us.
Traci, and I hope this isn't sort of going into areas that I know are probably difficult to remember. Give us a couple of examples of what you would consider to be the most ridiculous hurdles you had to jump or denials, or because I mean, this was more than just, I'm not sure you can have a PET CT, which in and of itself, to me, I don't understand. A highly recognized specialist in the field says, I need this test, and someone else who has no knowledge of the patient says, I don't think so. But give us a couple of examples of some of the really sort of egregious denials. Yeah, maybe the list of the top 10, because I know there's probably a whole lot more than that, but just a few.
Yeah. Okay. One, when we were in Santa Monica, Dan was on continuous chemotherapy. So he, for 2 weeks, wore, a little bag that was infusing chemo over 2 weeks continuously. And we would go into the office for a checkup, and they would do a blood count, and his counts were low, and they wanted to give him some leukine, like a white blood cell augmenter. And of course, it needed prior auth, and urgent prior auth was going to be 72 hours, and it was the weekend. And it's like, okay, either he needs it now, or he's going to wind up in the hospital. He's either going to make it, or he's going to wind up in the hospital with a complication over the weekend. Like, this is something that needs to be done now.
Right.
So that was something we were going back, and he was getting radiation at the same time. We were going back and forth, and we went to radiation, and we came back to the office, and we're like, we'll just pay for it. We'll just pay for it. And then finally somebody was able to, Becky, our clinical care coordinator, was able to get it put through. So he could get it, but it was ridiculous. His radiation too was denied, and there was a time crunch. I mean, he had a certain period of time where he needed to get this, and they denied it. And again, our clinical care coordinator was working on it, and we were like driving to the center, and it had been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And we were going to be leaving town, and we needed to get the radiation started. And finally, we walk into the lobby, and finally we get a call like, it's approved. And at the same time, he gets a call, an automated call from the health insurance company that was denied. So that was pretty ridiculous. And then of course that chemo was denied originally and then approved. And then later in the summer, his chemo and immunotherapy was denied, but then approved, and he got it. And this is the worst of all. After he passed away and he got the chemo, we got a letter saying that Evacor, medical director at Evacor, overturned it and said it wasn't medically indicated after he knew it was approved and he got it. And, we're talking $80,000 worth of chemotherapy and immunotherapy.
So, and I want to sort of put emphasis to this for all the listeners. After the chemo, and none of this, I would suggest, none of this is like highly experimental. I mean, it's a very difficult disease, a very difficult diagnosis, but the chemotherapy that we're doing, the radiation, this is the best tools that those specialists have to combat this disease. It's not, they're not grasping at straws here. This is the best science that they've got. But so after it's been received, retrospectively, a medical director who more than likely is not an oncologist, more than likely spent little, if no time reviewing Dan's chart. Probably my guess is never talked to the physicians that were treating him actively. Retrospectively denied $80,000 worth of therapy, and you received the letter the day he passed?
It was dated the day he passed. I received it probably about a week, 10 days later. So in the thick of the grief. He was actually, I do want to be accurate in what I say. He was an oncologist.
Oh, okay, good.
He was an oncologist. I actually tried to do exactly what Dan did, and I tried to find him. He's in Maryland. And I was going to call his office and see if he treated chondrosarcoma, because it is a rare disease. And the fact that he had a dedifferentiated subtype makes it even more rare. So there's not distinct guidelines. But he's retired and he's only working for Evacor. But I think you can say probably with 90% confidence that he's not a sarcoma expert. And in order to fully understand why this treatment was recommended, and by the way, it was recommended in collaboration both with our Mayo oncologist here in Phoenix and with our California oncologist, who's a international expert in sarcoma as well.
Right. Yeah, and that to me is if I were one of those physicians specializing in this very rare, it would be insulting to me that a retired oncologist is trying to tell me they know more about this disease state than I do. Now, the fact that Evacor is owned by an insurance company always leads anyone who's at all skeptical to wonder what their motivations are. And that if they approve too many of these things, will the insurance companies look for somebody else to do these external reviews? It just, the whole thing, doesn't feel right. And especially at a time where you're dealing with the loss of your husband, everything, and dealing with that grief, to get a letter like that, I would argue is emotional abuse. I mean, I'm trying to be very careful about language so we can actually air this podcast, because I want to say other things, but I just wanted everybody, and I appreciate you telling the story, to understand this was not just a one time a PET CT didn't get authorized. This was a constant battle for both of you that extended past, his passing. And that, in my opinion, is unacceptable behavior, and something that, and I know that's why Dan really wanted to try to change this so that somebody in the future didn't have to go through the same thing.
I was going to kind of switch gears again as we wrap this up to what's happening now in your lives. And I wonder if any of you had spoken to any sort of physician advocacy groups, patient advocacy groups, to talk about Dan's experience, to talk about your experience as being his family members, and what the reception has been like, and if you're hearing any good news as to whether some of these things are changing.
Dan had met with an attorney in California prior to his passing, and she had reached out to me afterwards, and we've gotten together a few times and met, and we're still trying to figure out how to move forward with this. And of course, Wendell has been helpful, as has Ron, in trying, because Dan's goal was, obviously to say to reform all of healthcare insurance is a lofty, impossible goal, but his was like, he wanted to bring transparency and accountability to the physicians on the insurance side who deny and delay care as recommended by the patient's chosen physician. So holding the physicians at least accountable for their decisions that they're claiming are not, quote, medically indicated, and the fact that they're not considered to be practicing medicine is a difficult is a difficult spot to be in for the patient. So I know Ron has talked about wanting to try to get, signing a denial as seen as practicing medicine, and that's exactly what I think Dan would have wanted, as well as do I. And we've also done some advocacy through the Chondrosarcoma Foundation. They're so kind, and they set up an endowment fund in Dan's name that is used to help patients navigate through denials. And we actually have a case that we're working on, where we're helping them. And the president of the foundation, Jeff Kramer, is just also a very wonderful person and has really embraced Dan and what he's been trying to do. And we're so appreciative of that as well.
And we'll make sure that we've got the information for the Chondrosarcoma Foundation linked in the show notes as well.
I was talking to Dan one point, and another thing that surprised me is he said, look, I'm not saying that physicians shouldn't be questioned. So we're not perfect. And he said, I'm also not saying that there aren't bad doctors out there. There are. And he said, I'm just saying that we should put the patient at the center of this. And if there's, he said, if there was somebody, either, somebody that I referred to, a colleague of mine, or a medical director at an insurance company that doesn't believe I'm doing what's right for the patient, I'd be happy to talk to him over the phone. And he said, if I'm wrong, I'd be happy to change. If they can bring information for me that I don't have or whatever. That was his whole thing of, I just want it to be transparent. I want it to be patient first. I want those physicians to have the same obligations that I do. I want it to be expedited so that we're not delaying care. All of the things that I wanted as a patient, I want for all patients to get. And I thought that was a really sort of an interesting approach. It's not saying, burn it down. They should never question. It was, they should question the right way with the right time, so that the patient gets the best, not just say, well, it's denied and I won't talk to you. I told Traci, there's a number of states that are trying to get some state reform done. The state I live in North Carolina, is going to be pushing for some reform locally on prior auth and those kind of things legislatively. And really the hope is if we can get this thing started in a few states, it'll spread to other states and hopefully nationally. And hopefully somewhere down the road we can all say, hey Dan, we got you where you wanted to be, because it's just the right thing to do for patients. And so that's why we're doing this on this podcast. That's why I give some of the speeches I give, and why I'm donating some of my time to helping some of these state agencies entities try to get this legislatively, because the insurance companies aren't going to just change on their own because it's the right thing to do. There's just too much money involved for them not to. So we can keep pushing to affect change on them, so to speak.
As we wrap up, I want to turn it over to each of you, Traci, Tom, and Christine, and ask you to share some parting inspiration that you have that you can take away from Dan's life that would be helpful for our listeners, and just something that we can hold on to, I guess, for hope. We kind of want to end a little bit on a hopeful message. So I guess, Traci, I'll start with you, and then we'll kind of go around.
Well, that's a tough one. I think above all else, Dan has taught me how to be a better person. He truly was. He wasn't perfect. I don't want anyone to think he was not perfect, but he truly was a good person. He always tried to do the right thing, and he always tried to do everything with a little bit of humor or a lot of bit of humor. And truly, I mean, I know I'm biased, but he made the world a better place. He really did.
And I would agree with Traci. He used his humor to make the world a better place. Even in his diagnosis, he, for example, got matching canes for my dad, who was 88, and Dan, and they had matching canes. And he said, wow, I get to do this. I get to have a matching cane with my dad. How many people get that? So he was very funny. That helped. The other thing is, he always said, if I could just help one person by this, and he has already helped multiple people. I know people personally, even locally, I know somebody who just reading your story, Ron, about Dan and Wendell's, she knew that she could fight, a denial. And that was the raising awareness. So I think that's a very hopeful thing that Dan would have been very happy to see, that people are reading the stories that you guys have written, and gives them courage to fight for the denials they experience.
Yeah, and I don't really know how to follow up on either of those things, but I guess what I would say is kind of going back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier. One thing I think about Dan sometimes is that he did, like, when in situations where other people might just not do anything or not figure out how to help, just because it's easier, and not because they don't want to do good things, but just because if he saw something he could do, he would just do it. And I would like to be more that way. And maybe, I mean, that's something maybe for, that all of us can sort of take, that he, if we see whether on this, the issues that we're talking about of insurance reform and prior authorizations and all the things that need help, more than anything in our lives, that to bring that spirit of, oh, here's something I can do that might work or might help for someone else. I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to hesitate. That's something I think was great about Dan. It's something I hope I can take from him.
I think that your comments sort of echo what was rattling through my brain. Is I don't think it ever entered Dan's mind that I'm only one guy. What can I accomplish? I think that would be like him thinking that 1 and 1 equals 3. Why would you waste time being worried about whether or not you can be successful? It was just, get up and do. And if you can only do, if it only has a small amount of impact, that's better than no impact. And so, that was sort of rattling. You guys were talking the same thing, is that, what I take away from my limited experience with Dan is, don't get overwhelmed by the challenge, just solve the problem, and I was thinking about this, getting ready for this podcast, and there's the movie The Martian. There's the end of it where he's talking about how he lived on, it's a Matt Damon movie, and he's talking to his class, and he goes, well, you solve one problem, and then after that you solve the next problem. If you solve enough problems, you get to go home. And I just really think that's the way and that's what I try to take away from it, is just, okay, just get to work and solve the problem, and then solve the next one and the next one. Because I don't think he ever thought about whether or not he would be alive to see the impact, or whether there could be he was just one guy. It was, well, why not? Let's get started.
Well, Dr. Traci Hurley, Tom, Christine, I want to thank you very much for sitting down with us today and sharing your memories, the stories about Dan, sharing some inspiration, and also, again, raising more awareness about this issue and reminding patients that they can, in fact, fight some of these issues, and if they're religious believers like I am, and it seems like you all are as well, that, he's still advocating for them, perhaps in a different way now. So again, I want to thank you all for talking to us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.